In DSM V, we've made 3 major changes to autism from DSM IV. The first of these is a merging of the independent diagnoses of autistic disorder, Asperger disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder into a single spectrum disorder, autism spectrum disorder. Within that, we have eliminated childhood disintegrative disorder on the basis of it was not being used as a diagnosis, and more importantly, we've added a specifier age and onset, which allows a clinician to diagnose autism spectrum disorder with a later age and onset, typically after 3 years of age. The second major change in autism is the move from 3 criteria to 2, and this was done by combining the social and the communication criteria of DSM-IV into a single social communication or social reciprocity, which is the main feature of autistic spectrum disorder. Within autism spectrum disorder, the social communication deficits are impairing and lifelong persistent. The second criterion is restricted repetitive behaviors, and in that one, some patients actually, through training or developmental progress, may have less obvious manifestations of the RRBs during adolescence and adulthood, so that criterion can be met on the basis of history alone. The third major change to the autistic disorders I've already mentioned, and that's the inclusion of a number of specifiers. We expect clinicians to assign a primary diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but then to provide a very rich degree of information about that individual patient's onset and clinical course by the use of descriptors for age and onset, type of onset, were their skills lost or not, is intellectual impairment present, is verbal impairment present, as well as what kind of disorders are associated. As we know, autism spectrum disorder is frequently comorbid with intellectual disability, but it's also frequently comorbid with anxiety disorders, ADHD, and in the medical realm, epilepsy. The work group has given a lot of consideration to the question of what will the impact of the recommended changes be. Probably the most important question has been, is there going to be a change in prevalence as a direct result of the change in criteria? We frankly expect that it will not change much. The criteria being used in DSM-V are basically the same as those of DSM-IV. They have been modified to be much more descriptive of individual patients and to more accurately reflect the range of symptom severity. However, we have not included new patient groups or excluded any of the patient groups. The second question has been, how is this going to impact research going forward? And to be honest on this one, again, the changes are minimal, in that the field had already moved to using a single autism spectrum disorder, with over 95% of the publications in the last 5 years using ASD rather than the individual diagnoses of autism, Asperger disorder, or PDD-NOS.
Caffeine is a drug, a mild stimulant, which is used by almost everybody on a daily basis. Normally there's no problem with that. Its mild stimulant effects actually help us wake up in the morning. But it does have a letdown afterwards. Usually this is so very mild people would hardly notice it, but if you drink a lot of coffee, at least 2 or 3 cups at a time, there will be a rebound or withdrawal effect, which is a kind of tiredness or sleepiness. And it's been studied by scientists in the laboratory and found that in normal humans, after 2 or 3 cups of coffee, even under double-blind conditions where people are given a placebo to have them not know that they're being withdrawn, this shows a definite withdrawal, but usually it's not very severe and not clinically significant. Because of the good science that is around this subject, we decided that caffeine withdrawal would be placed in DSM. We did not say caffeine use disorder, even though there is evidence that rarely some people do have a clinically significant disorder from drinking caffeine-containing beverages. But it isn't clear that it's clinically significant, so we only put it in Section 3, which is to stimulate further research. Gambling disorder has always been in the DSM. It's a very severe problem for some people. It's determined by genes in large measure, and it can really wreck families and wreck lives. We also have been doing research on gambling disorder and decided that it resembles addictions, drug addictions, not only in its behavior but also in the brain. The gambling behavior activates the same reward system in the brain that drugs activate, and with this activation, a strong sense of reward and pleasure occurs, and this actually is the cause of learning. Unfortunately, the learning that occurs with gambling or drug addiction is always pathological or bad for you, and so we find that drugs or behaviors that activate the reward system directly and intensely are all bad. For that reason, we added gambling to the list of behavioral addictions.
The overarching goal of the DSM-5 revision has been to take into account all of the advances that have been made scientifically and clinically over the approximately 20 years since the last revision. The aim has been to, wherever possible, make appropriate changes in criteria and establish new diagnoses that would make it better for patients and their families in terms of the care that they will ultimately receive if they do have a mental disorder.
The internet has been around and it's used by millions of people over the last couple of decades, and it turns out that some people can abuse something even that good. If people get so captivated by internet, especially playing games, and these are often group games with other people, they often neglect other things and are doing it compulsively, and perhaps this can be considered an addiction. In fact, in other countries such as China and Korea and Japan, there's a lot of patients being treated for what they call internet addiction, and in China there are whole hospitals dedicated to treating this disorder, usually in young males. We've studied this, we've read the papers, and actually visited a hospital in China where this disorder is being treated, and decided that it's not quite ready to be in the main list of psychiatric disorders, but there is a section called Section 3, which is there to stimulate research. There we give the reader some inkling of what this could be and what are some of the things that are lacking before we can accord it the full representation in the main part of the DSM.
We're proposing a single specific learning disorder for DSM-5. That will incorporate deficits of reading, arithmetic, writing, and even executive function, as these are the things that impact on academic achievement. Not only will individuals with unexpectedly low performance be included, but those for whom achieving average grades or even above average performance takes considerable effort. The criteria specify that the symptoms should start during the grade school age, but might not be manifest until the demands exceed the individual's capacities, such as timed tests or excessively heavy academic loads. We do not use specific terms such as dyslexia or dyscalculia, as those were found to be useful as long as everybody agreed on the definition. And instead we're identifying the academic difficulties that then cause impairment, not only in academic but occupational and social performance. The impact of changing to a single diagnosis of specific learning disorder will be that it's going to be easier for clinicians to make this diagnosis for their patients. Rather than having to identify whether this deficit is limited to only reading or only mathematics or only written expression, the clinician can identify that there's a failure to be able to perform academically at a level appropriate for that individual's intelligence and chronologic age. And then, after they've made the diagnosis specific learning disorder, to really provide a rich detail into the types of deficits that individual has.
One of the changes that we've made to the diagnosis of mania and hypomania is to give greater prominence to changes in activity and energy in addition to changes in mood. In the DSM-4, changes in activity and energy were buried in the second criterion, but we thought that it was really important to move it up to the primary criterion for a diagnosis of mania or hypomania. And our thinking about that had to do with the fact that many individuals who experience the changes in mood, elevated mood, that go along with mania or hypomania, see those changes as very much a part of themselves, and those changes can be very subtle. So when asked to go back in their own history, they may not remember the changes in mood, whereas changes in energy and activity are much more objectifiable, much more memorable. And so we thought this would probably improve the longitudinal diagnosis of bipolar disorder, particularly when someone presents in an episode of depression and is being asked about past episodes of mania or hypomania.
One of the things that we did, which was a major change for DSM-5, was to institute a first cut of the neurocognitive disorders into what we would call mild neurocognitive disorder and major neurocognitive disorder. Major neurocognitive disorder is basically what in the previous age was called dementia, and which will still be in parentheses, so major cognitive disorder is equivalent to dementia. Mild neurocognitive disorder varies from major neurocognitive disorder in being less severe. It varies from just the normal old age forgetfulness, or just the cognitive changes that occur with aging, primarily in terms of, first, older persons would recognize that they have a problem, often seeking medical help for that problem. Second, on objective testing, they clearly would be below what we'd expect to be the normal functioning, usually 1 to 2 standard deviations below on a variety of different neuropsychological tests. The third thing is that even though persons with mild neurocognitive disorder are able to function, they have difficulty functioning, and they recognize that difficulty functioning. So they may be able to drive from their home to the doctor's office and back again. They may have to think twice. They may make a mistake in terms of a turn that they make. They may be able to balance their checkbook, but it takes them a longer time to do that. So this recognition of having problems coupled with clear evidence of more trouble with function, though not at the level that the person would actually not be able to function, distinguishes mild neurocognitive disorder. Some people have raised the question as to why we would include mild neurocognitive disorders in DSM-5. A couple of reasons, I think, would really puts this in perspective. First, older persons are seeking help for this problem, and it's a real problem. It's not a made-up problem. It's not a normal problem of aging, and therefore this will provide an opportunity for these people to be recognized as having a very real problem that needs to be worked up, it needs to be evaluated. Second, we're learning that neurocognitive disorders, regardless of maybe it being Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia, etc., in fact, are moving upstream, we call, in terms of our ability to recognize and diagnose these disorders fairly soon, if not now, by different biological markers, such as brain imaging, etc. So the ability to identify these problems early on from a clinical perspective will match our ability to identify them from the perspective of the biological markers. And finally, it's going to be early on that we're going to treat these disorders, not later on when the full dementia syndrome emerges.
One of the problems that the Mood Disorders Work Group identified in the area of mood disorders was the DSM-4 diagnosis of mixed episode. That diagnosis required that an individual simultaneously meet the full criteria for an episode of major depression and an episode of mania. The data suggested, and we believed, that individuals rarely meet full criteria for both kinds of episodes at the same time, and furthermore that clinicians generally use the term mixed to refer to something much more subtle, a much more subtle combination of mania and depression. Therefore, in DSM-5, we'll be using a mixed specifier that can be applied either to an episode of major depression or to an episode of mania. In the case of depression, the mixed episode specifier requires 3 manic symptoms be present that don't overlap with the symptoms of major depression. In the case of mania, we require that 3 depressive symptoms be present that don't overlap with the criteria for mania. We believe that this is much more consistent with how the term mixed is actually used in clinical practice and will be much more meaningful in terms of prognostic and treatment planning decisions.
Our work group has finished the work for DSM-5 for the schizophrenia spectrum and related psychotic disorders. Schizophrenia, of course, is the paradigm disorder in that group. We have made some modifications there. First, we plan to drop the subgroups. The subtypes have not been a strong heuristic not much validity, and patients tend to not be stable in their subtype assignment. So we're dropping subtypes. We also wanted to use that to de-emphasize the connection with catatonia. Catatonia is fairly common, more common in mood disorders and a number of medical conditions, but also several of the psychotic conditions. So there we propose using it as a specifier, and a new disorder, catatonia, that would be used just in those circumstances where the clinician did not yet know what the underlying disorder would be. With the criteria themselves, we're de-emphasizing the bizarreness or the Snyderian first-rank symptoms simply by saying that a criteria have to be met with 2 or more. Not a single bizarre delusion or bizarre hallucination would be sufficient. They need 2 or more of the 5 criteria, and at least one of those has to be psychosis itself.
In DSM-5, substance use disorders will be diagnosed with a clinical interview, just as it is in DSM-4. The major difference is that there will be a continuum between early use and more severe use and eventually the most severe use with 11 different symptoms. In DSM-4, we had essentially 2 diagnoses. One was abuse and the other dependence. And in 1980s, we thought that this was the way it was in nature. Since that time, by doing a lot of research, we've discovered that addiction doesn't work that way. It starts off mild at the beginning and becomes gradually more severe, and it's more realistic if we use only a single dimension. Not only that, we don't use abuse and dependence anymore, because abuse in the old way is not really milder than the dependence. And secondly, the word dependence is very much a problem. Dependence can be completely normal if we're just following doctor's orders, but dependence on alcohol, which is a bad drug, will be pathological and lead to problems. But when we used dependence, people tended to think that dependence equals addiction, and it doesn't as long as you're following your doctor's orders.
A concern about the new approach to diagnosis in DSM-5 has been that the number of people diagnosed with a mild condition might increase dramatically. We've been very careful to look at how the diagnostic properties of DSM-4 compare to DSM-5. What we found is that in DSM-4, it often took only 1 symptom to make a diagnosis. To get a diagnosis of abuse to the substance in DSM-4, it only took 1 criteria out of a list of 4. What happens in DSM-5 is that the minimum required number of criteria is 2. So we found that the actual number of people diagnosed with a disorder in DSM-5 is likely to not increase at all and may even be lower for certain substances. Thus, the idea that the people diagnosed with DSM-5 will increase dramatically from DSM-4 is not supported by a large number of population data sets.
One of the issues in revising the DSM-5 was to do a better job of separating out normal sadness, grief, bereavement from making a diagnosis of clinical depression. In order to do this, after reviewing the literature and having a number of our advisors go over all the material that was available, we decided to remove the fact that clinicians should not make a diagnosis of clinical depression in anybody who has suffered a loss before 2 or 3 months. We did this because we felt it was very important that patients and clinicians have an opportunity to make sure that patients and their families receive the appropriate diagnosis and perhaps the correct intervention without necessarily being constrained by a period of time. In the same sense, it is important to realize that we have provided material in the manual to make sure that it is understood that sadness, grief, and bereavement are not things that have a time limitation to them. It is not something that goes away within 2 or 3 months. It probably extends at least a year and perhaps beyond. And we need to understand the differences more clearly between the sadness and grief and those conditions that require intervention.